Every NHL general manager wants to build out a roster that can compete for a Stanley Cup. The goal of every trade is to improve both respective quads on both teams. Trade in the NHL usually work out well, and both teams improve in areas that they want to fix, whether that's with assets, players, or just addressing weaknesses that the roster has. But there are some times where trades just feel completely one-sided, leaving the team that gets the best player on top of the world, while the other team continues to think, why did we ever make this deal? And often this happens more than you would think in the NHL, especially recently. Well, today we're going to be looking at 7 more trades that are completely lopsided from the past decade of the NHL. And a lot of these trades, they just continue to age worse and worse as time goes on, with some being even more recent that we're going to go through in a couple of minutes. Now, if you guys have been liking the content lately, make sure you hit that subscribe button and like this video, and let's get right into this one. Now, the first trade on my list, it's an incredibly recent one between the Boston Bruins and the Ottawa Senators, and this trade continues day by day to look worse and worse for the Boston Bruins. Now, the trade we're talking about is with Linus Ullmark. The Boston Bruins trade Linus Ullmark to the Ottawa Senators on Monday for Joonas Korpisalo, Kastelic, and a first-round pick in the 2024 draft, which was 25th overall. Now, we're talking about Linus Ullmark, a goalie who is only about a year or two removed from a Vezina winning season where he put up some of the best numbers of his career. Now, the reason Boston moved on from this goalie is because they had a 1-2 punch with Swayman and Ullmark, and with Swayman being younger and taking control over the net in the playoffs this year, it was very likely that the Bruins were going to move on from Ullmark based on salary cap issues. But the issue here is that they really got nothing in return for a Vezina goalie and took on one of the worst goalie contracts in the NHL with Joonas Korpisalo. Korpisalo and Anton Forsberg had the worst numbers when it comes to save percentage and goals against average with the Ottawa Senators last year, and people were talking about this Korpisalo contract either being bought out by the Ottawa Senators or just being one of the most immovable contracts in the NHL. Now, unfortunately for Boston, this really doesn't do much for them. They gained $2 million in cap space because the Ottawa Senators retained 25% of Korpisalo's deal, but in return they get a goalie that is really more of a project than someone who's consistent. And with the Bruins having a great goalie in the AHL in Brandon Bussi, who they just signed to a 3-year deal, this just leaves you scratching your head because Boston has other areas of their roster that they need to improve on, like a top 6 winger, and of course we all know some top 2 line centers. I think this one's going to age very poorly for Boston. If this draft pick they just took ends up panning out, then maybe it won't look so bad, but right now in this moment it's seeming like the Ottawa Senators got away with highway robbery here, and the Bruins trade away one of their biggest assets for practically nothing. Second trade on my list, this one's a few years back, and a lot of people don't remember that Devon Toews actually played for the New York Islanders for a little bit. But do you know that the Islanders traded him away for really nothing at that time? Devon Toews was traded to the Colorado Avalanche by the Islanders for a 2nd-round pick in 2021 and another 2nd-round pick in 2022. Devon Toews has gone on to become one of the best top-line defensemen in the NHL. He plays alongside Cale Makar, and I think almost any team in the league would love to have him on their top line. But unfortunately for the Islanders, they went on a different route, and by moving on from Toews, they were unable to pair him with Noah Dobson and have arguably one of the best top-line defensive pairings in the league. Now, Devon Toews is on a fantastic contract with the Avs. He helped them win a Stanley Cup a couple of years ago and continues to be one of the better defensemen in the league, which is just unfortunate considering that the Islanders really didn't get all that much back for him. Those 2 2nd-round picks, they haven't really amounted to much, and the Islanders and their fan base are probably wishing that they could go back in time and reverse this one. This one isn't the worst trade because, you know, they probably could have gotten more back from it. I'm not sure if other teams were bidding a lot more for a guy like Devon Toews or if his game was at the same level that it is right now with the Colorado Avalanche. But seeing all of the stuff with Toews today, it definitely doesn't look great in hindsight, and I think the New York Islanders would probably want to go back on this one if they could. Trade number 3, arguably one of the worst trades that I can think of in recent memory, and I almost forgot in my last video, but a lot of you guys reminded me, so we're going to talk about it today. Taylor Hall. The Edmonton Oilers paid a massive price to acquire a puck-moving defenseman, trading their previous number 1 overall pick Taylor Hall for the New Jersey Devils for defenseman Adam Larson, basically a 1-for-1 trade. This didn't look as bad at the time, I mean, at least for that one season, but Taylor Hall would go on to win the Hart trophy, I'm pretty sure the very next year with the New Jersey Devils, just making you think this is one of the worst trades that the Edmonton Oilers have ever made. Now, Taylor Hall has kind of fizzled out after that 1 year, but at the time, if you were looking at this trade, you had to be so upset as an Oilers fan because you're bringing in players like McDavid and Draisaitl, and I still think Taylor Hall would fit in nicely with this team. He really kind of has taken on that role of a third line player, and I think for the Edmonton Oilers, they've always struggled with depth. Now, that was kind of fixed in the playoffs this year, but the years before, they really could have used a player like Taylor Hall, and I'm not sure if he would have signed for a cheap enough contract for them to have kept him on the roster, but they could have at least gotten something a little bit better back than Adam Larson, a guy who just never panned out for this team or their roster. He just had no chemistry with them. And for Taylor Hall winning that MVP, it was really a slap in the face for the Oilers because this trade could have been much higher if they just shopped him around a bit more. But unfortunately, they just really wanted that puck-moving defenseman and paid a huge price for it, and will go down as easily one of the worst trades of the past decade. Next up is another fairly recent one. I didn't forget about this one last time, but I just didn't know if we were far enough removed to talk about how bad it was. Then I saw that the LA Kings traded this guy to the Washington Capitals, and I was like, we need to talk about this. Last season, the Winnipeg Jets traded a previous third overall pick, Pierre-Luc Dubois, to the Los Angeles Kings on June 27th for forwards Gabriel Velarde, Alex Iafallo, and Rasmus Kupari, also grabbing a second round pick in the 2024 draft, which they used this year. This will go down as one of the worst trades in LA Kings history because they extended him for an 8-year contract, making $8 million a year, and then immediately flipped him for Darcy Kemper, who is also on a pretty terrible contract with the Washington Capitals. Now, I know that the LA Kings need a goalie, but they just ran it with Cam Talbot last year. That didn't work, and I feel like Darcy Kemper and Cam Talbot are pretty comparable goalies. They're both just kind of veteran guys flying around the league right now, and for the LA Kings, they sort of are going towards a younger roster and need a more consistent presence in net if they want to be taken seriously in the playoffs. This Pierre-Luc Dubois trade, it just looks terrible in hindsight because Gabriel Velarde and Alex Iafallo have become incredible players for the Winnipeg Jets. They get two guys who are immediately starters while getting rid of a guy who seemed to be a bit of a locker room bad luck charm for that team, and it continues to show for Pierre-Luc Dubois. He got moved out of Columbus, moved out of Winnipeg, and immediately moved out of LA, sent to a Washington Capitals team who just seems like they have no direction. Next up is also a pretty recent trade, and this one's with the recent Stanley Cup champions, the Florida Panthers. Now, some of you guys might remember this player playing with Florida, and some of you may not. But did you know that the Florida Panthers traded Owen Tippett, a 2023 third-round pick, and their 2024 first-round pick to the Flyers in 2022 in the deal that saw them bring in Claude Giroux in that year where they won the President's Trophy and were attempting to go on to win a Stanley Cup? Now, at the time, this wasn't terrible because the Florida Panthers really were in win-now mode. This was back when they still had Jonathan Huberdeau. They won the President's Trophy and were eventually knocked out in the second round, I believe, by the Tampa Bay Lightning. But unfortunately, in this trade, Owen Tippett has gone on to become an absolute stud with the Philadelphia Flyers. And yes, the Florida Panthers really aren't struggling too much. They just won the Stanley Cup. But of course, you're going to want to build for your future. And I think Owen Tippett was a great asset for them to keep around. I knew that the Panthers thought he was a great player, but I guess they were really just trying to make that big move because they were in such a win-now mode. But Owen Tippett's going to be a stud for years to come for Philadelphia. And I do think they came away on top with this one, especially for all of the picks that they got along with him. And the fact that Claude Giroux isn't even playing with the Panthers anymore. He's with Ottawa now. I do think that the Florida Panthers are fine. This didn't really affect the franchise all that much, but this trade in hindsight was really bad for Florida, and the Philadelphia Flyers won this one by a landslide. Next up is with another recent Stanley Cup winning team in the Vegas Golden Knights, and this player really never even played for the organization before he was traded, but in hindsight, I bet that Vegas wished they never made this deal. Back when the Vegas Golden Knights were first brought into the league, they decided to trade for a guy, Max Pacioretty. They traded him for forwards Thomas Tatar, forward prospect Nick Suzuki, and a second-round pick in the 2019 NHL draft. Now, we all know that Nick Suzuki has gone on to become an incredible young stud for the Montreal Canadiens. He's already their captain. He's putting up some big numbers for that team and really is proving to be a dynamic two-way forward for the Habs. Unfortunately for Vegas, the player that they got in return, sure, he was fine for about a year or two playing with the organization, but since then he's moved on, been on almost every single injury report you can think of and really just isn't a good asset for whatever team he's going to be playing on in the future. I think if Vegas had it their way, they would go back and reverse this trade. Had they known that Nick Suzuki was going to become the stud that he is today, I think he would be a great second line center for them as they move forward right under Jack Eichel. And who knows how much more competitive this team would be. I mean, we all know that everybody wants to play there and that their roster is elite, but come on, Nick Suzuki is a diamond in the rough, and to trade him along with other assets for a guy who is nearing the end of his career, it doesn't really make sense in hindsight. I mean, maybe at the time, since they went to the Cup Finals, it made sense for them, but I never liked this trade, and I always liked Nick Suzuki, so I think Vegas probably wishes they could go back on this one, and Montreal, they fleeced the Knights on this one, getting a lot of stuff that really wasn't worth it for a guy like Max Pacioretty. And the last trade we're going to talk about is a trade plus an extension, and I think if you guys have been watching the Chicago Blackhawks over the past couple of years, this is easily the worst contract for that team. Now, back when the Blackhawks were sort of making that final push to see if they could win a cup with Kane and Taves, they made a move for a defenseman, and it will go down as one of the worst extensions that the Blackhawks have made in recent history. They decided to trade Adam Boqvist, a first-round pick in 2021, a second-round pick in 2021, and a first-round pick in 2022 for Seth Jones, a 2021 first-round pick, and a 2022 sixth-round pick. Now, in hindsight, the trade itself isn't the worst thing. I mean, it doesn't feel like either team got fleeced, but I think what really hurt the Blackhawks was the extension they decided to sign Jones to. Seth Jones signed an 8-year, $76 million contract with the Blackhawks in 2021. The contract will have a cap hit of $9.5 million until it ends in 8 years. Now, Seth Jones, he's not a number one defenseman. I would argue that he might not even be a top-line defenseman for most teams, but for the Blackhawks, this is sort of aligned with like a Darnell Nurse contract, a deal that you're never going to be able to move because no team wants to pay a player like Jones this much money. And as you're building towards the future, it's going to cripple you for some moves that you could potentially make, especially with players like Connor Bedard and now Lev Shinov joining the team. I think if Chicago could go back, they just wouldn't make this deal at all. I know in hindsight, they were trying to make a push one last time with Kane and Taves, but this clearly wasn't the move. I don't think anybody saw that potential in Seth Jones or thought he was worth that money. They gave up great assets, young players, and picks just to get a guy who really isn't going to be a staple piece for them in the future. But unfortunately, they're just going to have to deal with it because this contract is one of the worst ones in the NHL. But these are 7 more trades that I think have either aged poorly or are just complete fleecings by one organization to another. Let me know if there are a few more if you guys want another part to this. I know you guys seem to enjoy this. Comment some bad trades below. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. I will see you guys in the next one.